there and smoke. I'm like your AJ Hawk because he's just stone cold quiet the entire time over there. Just,
It's just gonna be puffing.
hey, I'm saying something smart.
Turn up your volume. Because you're about to listen to The Sick Podcast. With Draft Vogel.
With the first pick in the 2021 NFL Draft. The first pick in the 2022 NFL Draft. With the first pick in the 2023 NFL Draft.
The sickest NFL Draft Show. It's gonna be sick.
And welcome into the Sick Podcast with Draft Vogel. I'm John Vogel, joined as always with my co-hosts here, Justen Gamble and Mark Jarvis. And gentlemen, we've got a little bit of a different topic that we wanted to get into tonight. But first off, everybody's doing all right, I suppose, on your end of the spectrum?
Yeah, I'm nervous because I don't know what we're talking about. I've read what we're talking about today, and I'm lost already. So I'm
excited.
Yeah, Jarvis is going to exploit.
Jarvis is the reason why we didn't get on top of this, because he wanted to make sure he wanted to be on the show when we talked about it, and it's probably a good thing considering the Gam still doesn't know what we're talking about. That Jarvis is here. So, what did I tell you, Gam? Just let the experts run this and figure it out for you.
Look, when I learn how to read, it's all over for you fools. Watch yourselves.
All right, so here we go. Let's get into this thing. Shane back there in the studio, go ahead. Let's pull up the first bit. So this is a quote, and it's coming from Thomas Dimitroff, who talked on the Sirius NFL radio on Late Hits, and I happened to be listening to it, and it was a very fascinating conversation they have. So the quote, back in those early 2000s, late 90s, when I was in my early scouting years, if you even alluded to the fact that you were even interested in looking at any box score data, all of the old boys would look at you like your head was up your you-know-where, because they'd say, you don't have a good enough feel. You need to go out and look at numbers. It was crazy. And nowadays, if you don't come to the table with a well-rounded view, some analytics and some data backing your evaluation, you know, these owners and their sons, by the way, and you guys know this, a lot of these sons who are now 25 and 30 and are taking over their parents' businesses in time, they're all about the data, which is a whole other topic. And he continued along with, in today's world, if you're not grasping the evolution of data in the league in the next 5 to 10 years, you're just going to be left behind. I'm not trying to be a martyr here, gentlemen, but I really do want those of us who are football people to make sure that they have a grasp on it, Marv, so we don't lose all of this to the data people of the world. And I say that lovingly, of course. I just think that it's important that we as football people continue to grasp the next waves of data and augmentation. Alex, this isn't about black box. This is about making sure that you're utilizing it to make you better as an evaluator, as a general manager, and not just to count on numbers, unquote. So Thomas Dimitroff, if you weren't already familiar with him, was the former general manager for the Atlanta Falcons. Was there for quite a while, worked around a couple different places in the league, and ever since has been working on the media side in a consulting firm, essentially is what they're running over there. They're doing some work for some teams, putting out this stuff, and he's done a really good job going around keeping a lot of these former general managers, you know, in the game, so to say. A lot of former scouts are working there with him at this, I forget the name of the website off the top of my head, but he got on Late Hits and they were talking about the data, the evolution of data in the league and how that's changing just the way that we look at scouting. So I thought this would be a really good topic to kind of get into, especially with his comments and the way that he kind of build up on it, especially since we talk about the in-depth parts of scouting and really go deep in the weeds on this podcast, and this is perfect for that. So Jarvis, I know you're really excited to get into this. When I sent you this quote, because I had to go and I had to transcribe it, you know, because this was not on the internet, and this wasn't something that was talked about a lot. I didn't find a single article of anybody talking about this. What was your takeaway when you first saw this quote?
It just got me so excited because it's very much blending that Gam, if you don't let me just talk, I'm gonna start asking you questions, and I'll let you. That was my thought. Is I'll pass it to you and see what you think.
Look. Before you start, I just thought it was funny that you're like, I got so excited, and I'm over here thinking. After John read that, I was like, I know some of those words. So I was like, it's just funny
that actually, I'm gonna pivot to what I was thinking about asking you. What words don't you get here? What part of this are you kind of? Because I feel like I've got a good grasp on this, so I want to make sure
you do, buddy. Well, okay, so augmentation, that's new. I'd say I know a lot of the words, but when you put them together with other words, then I'm a little lost. So, like, I get what he's saying. He's saying we need to, like, back in the day, if you brought analytics and data to like the meetings and blah blah blah, old school scouts and people would be like,
what the fuck's wrong?
That's what dummy. Yeah, you little idiot. But now it's like it's a big part of evaluations. It's a big part of what we do literally daily. And it's like you can't talk about football without bringing up some sort of data about like all this cool stuff. And it's more like him saying, it has to be a part of. We need to as football people, we have to understand how to use all this and how to utilize it and grow with it, or else we're going to be the ones that are kind of left behind, and the data people, the dorks, are going to take it over. But it's like it's cool because he's right, and even like myself, I remember first like breaking into this industry, and I was like, I don't need combine, I don't need anything, and then you realize as you go along, like it's a lot more useful than you think. It's not something I'd say rely on 100%, but it's like we had our combine episode that we were talking about recently, and it was like comparing all these numbers and putting them all side by side. There's a lot to go through, and it's because they are useful and they do have like historical precedent when you compare them, to all the classes with all the former classes and put all the data together. So I get what he's saying. It's like, but I'm just, it's a lot. I think I need a few hours to process, but we don't have that, unfortunately. So
okay, so Jarvis, go ahead and get into what you
yeah, let's do you.
Yeah, so to me, it almost kind of reminded me of my transition from being just purely, I want to watch the tape, I want to evaluate the players, and I want to just go based off that. I don't care about the numbers. I don't care about, maybe even, measurables. I just want to see the tape and evaluate that. And as you go on, you kind of, in my opinion, you kind of realize what you missed without that once you're kind of exposed to other things out there, right? So like I, for the longest time, was very iffy about using, this guy ran a 40 of such and such, and why does that matter? Well, unless you go through and see that data kind of laid out of, hey, corners over 4.6, it gets really ugly very quickly, what the base rate of success is, so on and so forth. And then you can even go further from that and into some of these other things that are more, rather than the traditional just combine metrics and things like that, you can go towards stuff that is creeping in now, like some of the player tracking stuff that is maybe more of that, how do I put this? So I'll switch to a different example here, right? The box score data that he uses as an example here, right? What's the value of box score data? Like I'll ask you, Gam, what's the value of a box score?
I don't know.
From a scouting perspective?
Yeah, is that what you mean? Like as a scout, or is this a
what does it tell you? What? No, it's not a trick question at all. What does a box score tell you? If I say Jordan Love passed for 300 yards and had 3 touchdowns and 1 interception, what does that tell you?
He had a good game.
Probably had a good game.
Had a good game, yeah.
But it's not a perfect representation, but it's a proxy, right? Like it's a rough outline of like, if he had this, we know he didn't just go out there and have like a Nathan Peterman just like throwing picks left and right. There's a range of possible ways this game went, but we know roughly if you have 300 yards and 3 touchdowns and 1 pick, you probably had a decent day. And I think anything you look at numbers wise is kind of in the same boat if it's a proxy for something, right? So a combine metric, what's the 40? It's a proxy for speed. It's a proxy for how athletic a guy is. So you could go down the list of even more of the advanced stuff. And I mean, it's not a perfect representation of the reality of what the guy does on the field, but it goes down that same line of it's just a representation of, right? It's a model of that. And I think from the standpoint of like the old school scout, it's easy to look at it and say, hey, I watched the tape I saw with my own eyes. I don't need to necessarily back that up with anything. But I think when you see something with your own eyes like that, and then you have maybe a model, let's simplify it and just say, hey, I thought the guy was really fast on tape and he goes out and runs a 4.6. Well, my subjective opinion on it, based on what I saw, clashes with that proxy for what the guy's athleticism is, right?
Right.
So I don't know if you want to go anywhere from that particularly, John, or we can kind of any particular points on this you want to kind of unpack. But
So the first thing I thought that was interesting, he didn't go into depth with it, but talking about, the owners needing this data now, especially because their kids are getting involved in taking over the family business. So I've actually been watching the Apple TV Dynasty about the New England Patriots documentary series, and if you haven't seen it, oh, dude, it's fantastic. It's nostalgic. It's bringing back a lot of those memories of the very early New England Patriots. It's got dudes all over it later, and so many players come back and coaches to talk about, what was going on at the time. But I'm going to use Robert Kraft as an example because the Kraft story that they talked about in this was fascinating. So Kraft was a fan that bought season tickets and then watching the team in the 70s, getting frustrated with how poorly they were doing, started actually trying to figure out how could I buy this team and take it over, because he wasn't a guy that was just loaded and had all this money. He couldn't just go buy a franchise. So he figured out that the money in the stadium was in the parking lots. So he literally found a way to purchase the parking lots and controlled the parking at the old Foxborough Stadium, saved up the money to buy the franchise and bought the franchise in 94. Okay, so that's how Robert Kraft became an owner. Now, Robert Kraft is, 30? This is 30 years later. Mr. Kraft is starting to get old, and now his sons, his family is starting to take over this, are starting to get into taking over the business. So a lot of these guys are 25, 30, 35, 40. They're in that range where they're looking at this from a business standpoint and kind of getting away from the football standpoint, right? And I think that's why he kind of brought up the owner's kids into it, especially, and then just cut it off, said, hey, that's a whole other topic for another day. But getting into, when you take that school of thought, where he's going with that, and then look at this very next thing that he talks about, hey, if you're not grasping the evolution of data in the league in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to be left behind. It's because these owners' kids are coming in, looking at it as a business, looking at it from a numbers perspective, spreadsheets, all those different things, and saying, this is what we like. The only way that we're going to keep football scouting alive, per se, is by continuing to pass on this stuff, but finding a way to incorporate analytics into it. So I think that was really the big point that he was trying to make, right? It's like it goes back to exactly why I started this podcast with the Sick Network. It was going back to C.O. Bricado, who is immortalized now with the award that Neil Stratton, Inside the League, gives out to the most influential scout, the guy that's really given the most to the game every year, recognized as a longtime scout in the league. That just, because a lot of these area guys that are in the league for 25, 30 years go unrecognized for so long. The C.O. Bricado Award is to recognize those guys. And Bricado's whole point was, hey, we need to pass on the knowledge of scouting so that these analytics people, which Dimitrov, refers to the data people of the world lovingly, of course, they don't take over scouting. And you lose the whole football thing, and we go into a Moneyball type deal where baseball's gone with the numbers, because football is a very different type of game. It's not so much the same repetitive type thing as baseball is, right? Where you can literally bet on those numbers and put those things together. Football's not like that. So Bricado wanted to spread the knowledge of scouting and make sure that everybody was passing on this knowledge and exchanging it to keep scouting, because it's an art, to keep that art alive.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of those guys that get the C.O. Bricado Award also do. They passed on this knowledge. They continue to pass on this knowledge to not just their coworkers, but their peers, people under them, people above them, just continuing on that legacy. So, because that's what Bricado was. He was a guy that just spread knowledge around. That's what I thought when I heard this, that Thomas Dimitrov was getting into, because there's so much of this that's becoming a business, that people are trying to look at it from a numbers perspective. And he's saying that you have to find a way to craft the numbers, to take all the numbers and put it together so that you can keep your scouting perspective alive without it losing it forever. But bringing it into this sort of, just combining the football with the analytics. And if you don't do that, you're going to get left behind, and you're not going to make it in this modern NFL. So it's really just it's the general push from, hey, we're tape people. We watch tape. We evaluate football players. Just like in the movie Moneyball, when you got all those scouts sitting there. Oh, you're crazy. We know baseball, and it's the same type of deal. But it's like you got to find a way to incorporate the numbers to the player.
Right.
I really think that's what Thomas was trying to say.
I got a lot of questions for you, John.
Okay.
Okay, so one, he's talking about it as in terms of football people versus data people. So what would be bad about data people? Like what would happen if, you get a bunch of data people in and football people are out? What do you lose, right? Like that's kind of
the art of scouting, essentially. You know what I'm saying? If you go to, everybody's looking at the data, everybody's looking for, hey, they have to fit this stereotype. It's what a lot of these teams have gone to with, the numbers, the cutoff numbers. You have to be, your arm length has to be here. Your speed has to be here. You have to test at these levels. They have these thresholds that certain teams won't draft under. You lose out on certain players, those outliers, essentially. There's not many of them, but there's a lot of guys that ended up becoming great at what they do, and they're considered an outlier because they wouldn't have fit those modern things. It's like we were talking about the combine deal, in the combine episode, the last one we did. Braden Fisk doesn't fit a lot of different perspectives, right? And a lot of these different thresholds that teams have. But he's going to be a really great player, and you can see that, right? But if we go to this augmentation type deal where you're looking at all these numbers and it's just, okay, well, check. Okay, we'll take him there, blah, blah, whatever. You're losing that whole human element that there is to football, and that's what you don't want to lose, essentially.
What I think you're losing a lot of nuance too, right? I mean,
yeah.
There's I've seen a lot of argument lately on Twitter from the fantasy and dynasty guys about Xavier Worthy, and they're like, he only had this amount of drops and he has this amount of drop rate and he only blah blah blah, so that proves he can catch. Okay, all he does is haul in screens and deep balls. So to be able to catch a deep ball, that's the easiest thing you could ever do. You're not running at full speed catching a ball in front of you in traffic. You're not using your hands. You're not doing a lot of things that you might not understand if you look at the numbers, but then you watch him and you're like, okay, he runs only a few routes and he's catching easy balls. It's like James Washington coming out of Oklahoma State or Mason Rudolph. The numbers would tell you these two are an elite duo. They run 3 plays there. They run 3 plays at Oklahoma State, and there's a little variance in each one. But James Washington can't run routes. He doesn't have the body type to bend his hips and sit down and transition and get in and out of breaks. He runs deep balls, and Mason Rudolph throws deep ball. Like, they don't do a lot of things that you might not know if you're just an analytics guy or just a data. But when you watch the game and you understand all the nuance and all the things that are behind the scenes, it's a lot easier to kind of separate these things. Like Troy Franklin is another guy this year that the dynasty community loves. The man struggles to catch the football. He struggles to catch in traffic. He struggles to use his hands. He struggles to really snatch it away from his frame. And we saw that in the gauntlet drill. The analytics will tell you he caught the same amount of balls as Keon Coleman, or like, you know what I mean? If you're just charting it, right? He caught the same amount of balls. Well, guess what? Keon ran faster and he stayed in a straight line and has no problem snatching that ball away from his frame, and he does it effortlessly, where we could see Troy Franklin's running away from the ball, trying to cradle it, turning his hands upside down. Like, it's different. And I think you just do lose a lot of that nuance when you say no more tape people or no more football.
And it's not to say that analytics people, like the data people, are going to ruin football. I don't think that's the idea. It's just the fact that it's saying you don't want to go this evolution where these younger owners, these younger families are starting to take over. They don't really understand the sport as much and are looking at the numbers and are trying to look at this from a baseball, from a Moneyball perspective. Okay, so you don't want to go strictly with the numbers. You want that to be a part of the evaluation. So what Thomas is trying to say, my opinion, I could be wrong. I'd love to have him on. Thomas, if you're listening, like, come on, let's talk about this, because this is right up our alleyway. I think what he's trying to say is you want to find a way to mix both of these worlds. and figure out how you can use the numbers to become better, which is what we're already doing on this podcast, right? Trying to figure out what the numbers tell us, how they make us better evaluators. But what we're trying to avoid is with the new ownership, with the younger ownership groups coming in and all these data, these heavy data backed packages, to not go strictly to data and to keep that football nuance, to keep that scouting, to keep Ricardo alive, essentially.
It's interesting. I think a few things. One, you mentioned, and this is going a little bit back, but you mentioned the aspect of like with baseball, right? How you can't necessarily treat football in the same way as baseball. You know the reason why you can't do that?
There's too many variables in football.
Goes back to the simple versus complex systems, right? Yeah. The 22 players interacting is a lot different than a baseball game where guys are kind of spaced out and they don't have as many interactions. So that's part of why in a situation like that, it's easier to apply those numbers, right? It's hard to apply a model or something like that to a complex system.
Right.
I think there's two angles here, and one of them I think is conflicting, right? So one is, I think this idea of football people versus data people is, how do I put this? When I started going down this path of trying to apply all these different things to my own work, I had to kind of take some of that football people in me and just pull it out of my body and throw it away, because it was no longer about, okay, I'm focused on watching the tape and that's my main thing. It was more, I want to do everything possible in my power to come up with the best possible predictions that I can, right? To get the player as accurate as I possibly can with the available resources, time, and all that I have, right? I think there is an element of people that are really, really focused on tape, forget about what they can't necessarily see on tape, that can be captured by numbers. And they kind of cling to that aspect of, okay, here's what I said. And it's the same way reverse with numbers, right? There are some people that are analytically driven that all they care about is, what do the numbers tell me? Even though the model is not always an accurate reflection of reality, right? The map is not always the territory. I think personally, I've just viewed Dimitrov's comments as he understands the way this is going, where the old school, hey, I'm just going to watch the film, I'm going to trust my human intuition, is kind of getting, I don't want to say phased out, but it's becoming a little bit less of a key player in the process. And he wants to make sure that people that are on the football side that kind of came up with that human intuition side of, I'm watching the tape, I'm evaluating the guy based on my own opinion, they don't get left behind by this. They don't get left behind and go, oh, I'm just going to stick to my bubble and I'm going to watch the tape and see things my way, and that's that. You're not going to change my mind. But rather to try to give them these tools and teach them and move them in a way where, hey, if we go strictly to the PFF people of the world, right? Like if I see some, I don't want to pick a particular PFF guy to knock on, but you've seen some of this guys where it's like, oh, this guy's, from Europe and he's a mathematician. And you're like, okay, you roll your eyes, but like they offer some brilliant insights. But the issue is they don't have the same built up human intuition that we have of if we study the game for years. I see things watching tape that he can't possibly capture.
I'm not trying to shit on PFF either, Jarvis, but sometimes those math whizzes from Europe come in here and say some of the most outlandish nonsense that we put up on, frozen cold takes. Like it just, I understand it goes both ways, but it's just more so of I would at least like to look like an idiot, by watching the tape and just being wrong than looking at some numbers and going, yeah, I was totally off without even seeing the guy. You know what I mean?
If you would come up,
maybe
with
that might just be me. That might just be me.
Well, and that's the thing is you have to combine them, right? Like there's a example I think of with chess, for instance. Like what creates the most powerful chess teams? It's not necessarily like man just by himself gets destroyed by machine. Machine by itself against a man versus machine combo loses, right? So like if you were to take, for instance, like an expert like world-class chess player and pair them with a machine that has the ability to compute a lot of things very quickly and kind of offer those insights and pair those together, it's going to beat one or the other outright. And I think when you look at it from that standpoint, I mean, I think the whole analytics versus tape thing falls into the same boat. There are things that I can't capture. Like, for instance, contested catch rate over the season. Gam, I know you watch a lot more tape than I do, but I might do 3 or 4 games on a guy. right? I might see 3-4 contested catches, and I might build an opinion about that based on the tape that I've seen and feel good about that because I saw it with my eyes, right? Like I watched this guy go up for a jump ball. It was beautiful, so on and so forth. And I'm like, okay, I saw it. I trust it.
Right.
But if I may not have access to that full season of statistical data that can be captured, like, boom, I just pull it up and bam, there's the whole contested catch rate. Now, you could get into the whole thing of how it's tracked and so on and so forth, and that's a whole different discussion. But the point is that there are things that you simply cannot capture with your own eyes watching tape. Even if you whether it's a biased sample size or so on and so forth, you have to have a blend. And I think that's kind of the point is you don't want to have the football people, so to speak, get too dug in on this is the way we do things. I'm going to stick to watching the tape. Your end game is not, in my opinion, to continue the art of scouting. I love scouting, right? Like that's I wouldn't be in here if I didn't. But it's not necessarily to continue the art of scouting. It's to make the best possible predictions and continue that forward in a way that applies to that, whether it's 30%, analytics, 70% tape, or 70% analytics and 30% tape. However that falls, you've got to do it however it works to make the best possible predictions going forward.
I mean, you just want to get better, right? I mean, that's the whole thing is like the cool thing about analytics I've realized is like it helps you see outliers, right? It'll help you make a lot of like times put percentages on certain things where I'm like, oh dude, this guy's tape's sick. I like everything he does on tape, blah, blah, blah. And then all his combine numbers come out and a bunch of different stats come out and like things about, this tackle, these are the tackles that have succeeded with this arm length, or these are the safeties that have run this time or had this short shuttle that have done. And then, so you kind of get to see like, oh, wow, he's going to have to really be an outlier in order to succeed, or he's going to have to kind of it's that type of thing. And it's with corners. I remember a few years ago, Lonnie Johnson from Kentucky, I believe.
Yep.
He was getting mocked in the first round a lot. And I believe I'm on the right guy. And then he comes out and runs in the 4.6s or something. And I remember a bunch of people, I mean, myself included, were like, all right, write him off. Like, look at the corners who have run 4.6 or higher. It's a bad list. And people were like, well, that's stupid. Trust the tape. And I'm like, look, I do. But I already had some speed questions about what I saw on tape, and he kind of just answered them. And now the type of outlier he would have to be to succeed at that size and speed is drastic. Wild. And and now, these data guys are giving me percentages and like lists of all this. I'm like, great. That's beautiful. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I can add it to my, my eval, and it's making me a more complete evaluator versus just, trust the tape. Like, cause we screw up sometimes and we're not always right. And that's the thing is like we're not always right, whether how proud we are or how good we really think we are. It's just, we're going to screw up. So I think the coolest thing that I've really added into my evaluations is that data really helps you kind of separate guys. And then you get to go off your intuition and your instincts and your tape work, but you at least know like, there's a big chance I'm going to be wrong here versus look, this guy fits 97% whatever of this. I'm going to roll the dice with him because it's going to take a lot of, like the data says to do so. It would be wild if he busted, and you feel better about yourself at the end of the day when you do that versus going against something that clearly says he's going to have to be this huge exception to the rule. And then you're wrong. And you're like, I should just listen. You know what I mean? So I just like it because it makes me a more complete evaluator. It makes me kind of feel better about what I do at the end of the day. And it makes me feel like I have more information to go off of.
And I'll throw out this too, is this aspect of like, there is I think a gap between some of the stuff that gets put out there by people in the analytics community, if you want to classify it as that, and you'll read something and unless you have the background knowledge to understand what they're trying to say, it's like reading Greek, right? Like, right. You're using all these abbreviations for things I don't understand. And it's like, if you were to try to take that and you had some way to tell me that in a football sense, it makes it a lot easier, right? So I think it's a matter of trying to pair that. So like when I bring concepts to you, whether it's something from psychology or whatever else it is, I have to find a way to navigate that particular branch of knowledge and bring it to you and apply it to football in a way that makes sense. I can bridge that gap because I come from the football background, right? And I can find ways to convey that. But if you have someone who doesn't come from that background, there's no bridge, right? So I think Dimitrov, for instance, is being a pretty good bridge so far from the stuff I've seen from him that he shares based on the kind of the work that he's done with, I think Sumer Sports, right? Is that what it was you were looking for, John?
Sumer.
Oh,
That's
it is that.
So he can take a concept that, Eric Eager is, I think he is a mathematical biologist, was what he graduated in. So like, okay, he didn't have that traditional background necessarily. I think he did play football, but maybe not in terms of the scouting background where it's, okay, I'm going to watch the tape and this and that. But point being that he needs a translator in the same way that if I wanted to take my thoughts and my ideas from football and my human intuitions that I pick up and try to transition those to someone with a mathematical background, I'd have to find a bridge for that, right? So, okay, I'm running into a problem. Let's say I'm trying to figure out, what's a good example? What's one problem that you're running into with watching guys where you're kind of like stuck? Like, oh, is it an arm length thing or speed? Like, what things do you want to answer? What questions?
I think the toughest thing for me, I even had conversations on Twitter about it today. Safeties. It's such a subjective position in general to try and evaluate. A lot of guys will say they see range, and it's like, well, is he actually rangy, or was he just kind of in position to make a play on the ball? It's hard to tell what a safety's thinking at any given time. It's hard to see really a lot of like the human element as far as evaluating safeties. I wish there was more data or something to help me, but it comes down to just, I got to trust my football knowledge, and some people are good at it, some people are not. I find myself sometimes in the middle where I'm like, oh, I really understand my eval on this guy, and sometimes I'm lost. And I don't know where to go from there. I'm like, give me some sort of, I wish the analytics nerds would give me something on that, but they never do. It's all about the skill players, and it's really frustrating.
So as an example for that one thing, and this is not something that I have the knowledge or, the experience with, but like, for instance, player tracking data, right, has gotten very popular lately. They're starting to do stuff with the big data bowl that involves that. So you could look at that from the standpoint of, okay, if we're trying to figure out what's the pure range of a safety versus maybe how cerebral he is. Okay, let's look at his positioning, right? So, okay, is he the type of guy where he has to cover a lot of ground, he's very athletic, or is he the guy who he's maybe not necessarily hitting those same top end speeds, but he's kind of just, his positioning is very consistent. There's and again, this is something I'm not super well versed in, but another example would be like how close a guy is to the ball. They've actually created metrics to track like tackle opportunities, right? So based on how far the guy is from the ball, what are the odds he should be able to make a tackle? And then you can judge kind of how good of a tackler he is from that. Obviously there's limitations, right? Okay, this guy was supposed to, I think you gave an example, a few weeks ago or something like that, where maybe a guy takes on a puller or something like that. He's not supposed to be the tackler. It gets split over to him, and he ends up having to try to make a play from out of position. He misses the tackle and gets blamed. That gets charted as a loss or as a bad play, right? Because it was something that wasn't necessarily in his assignment, but he kind of was forced to do it, if that makes sense. Right. I think you gave that example.
Yeah, that's when we're talking about linebackers.
Yeah. So that's a perfect example where these metrics and these tools can never perfectly capture that, right? In the same way that if you're as a human judge, if I watch that, how do I turn that into a final grade, right? Like what's that one rep worth on my final overall grade on a guy? Like there's very much a black box element to human thinking just as much as there is to some of these algorithms and what they come up with. But I think the biggest thing for me is, again, if you're going to come in it with that mindset of, okay, I'm a football person, right? How do I find that bridge to take these ideas and these things from football and try to go over and apply that, with someone who has that mathematical background, who has the analytics background, and how do we come up with something that actually gives value to both of us?
I dig that. That's actually like perfectly said. It's basically, are you just saying learn how to apply everything, all this data, everything, learn how to apply it, because at the end of the day, if you can't apply it, there's no reason to have it, but you also kind of have to have the football knowledge to know why you're applying it. Is that?
Yeah. So for instance, I've seen some different stuff from the big data bowls, like some of their winners or not even that, but just some of their competitors in there. And you'll see maybe a very, very cool representation of something. And you're like, okay, well, you're using this advanced model to tell me the distance of each guy from the ball carrier and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, what the hell does that tell me that I can use to either apply if like I was a coach or in a scouting standpoint? Like, what can I do with this? Like, it's cool, but okay, what do I do with it from there? So I think that's kind of the thing you run into is how do you, I don't have the time to go learn all this stuff and go apply it necessarily. I have to find someone who has that background, who has the capabilities to do it. In the same way that they're not going to go spend years and years learning how to scout. They have to rely to some degree on my intuition when I scout, and they have to find ways to use that benefits what they're doing.
Right.
John, you look like you're brooding over there. I feel like you've got a lot to say.
No, I'm thinking because it's just, I think that's overall what he's trying to say, and I think the last thing is he feels like he probably lost his job in the league because he was behind on this data, right? And how to utilize it. And that kind of, because, there's that one point where he's talking about, I'm not trying to be a martyr here, but I really do want those of us who are football people to make sure we have a grasp on it, so, and then, closing it out, obviously, with this is about making sure you're utilizing it to be better as an evaluator, which is overall the whole point of it, right? And that's why you're trying to find a bridge. But overall, to go back to my initial point, I do think it is about keeping the art of scouting alive. I really do. And I think because you had kind of mentioned that, you said, I don't think it's necessarily about that as much as the art of scouting is evolving, right? To where you have to be able to use these numbers and you have to be able to back up what you're looking at with the data that's there. And so it's about figuring out what's the best numbers to use to back up those kinds of data. And we've got so many different things that are coming out now. We've got the chips now, and I think their uniforms, their jerseys, while their T-shirts, while they're running around the combine, so we can track their miles per hour and all those crazy different things that come out of that. So we got even more stuff that's coming in that we're going to have to figure out how to utilize, because because of the miles per hour that these guys were topping out at don't honestly ever match the 40s, that they're running. So there's so many more data points that are coming in that are entering into football in general that we're going to have to figure out how to use. And that's really what it is, that grasping the next waves of data, is how do we apply that to what we're seeing on the field? I think that's the real question. I think that's what that was the point he was really trying to make.
John, I say this with a lot of love. This is the first time to get combative with you on here. So are you ready? Let me ask you this. He's got the hat. He's pulling the hat over. Okay.
Oh boy.
What's the art of scouting? Like, define it. What would it be to you?
That's a good question. I think it's honestly, it's the human element of it, right? Where you go out there and you're looking and you're watching and understanding what a guy's doing, trying to figure out what he's thinking. I think it's the human element of evaluating a player and, all the nuances that come with that. I think that's what the art of scouting is. It is an art, it's just like any other artist. You're trying to get better at your craft. You're trying to come up with a clearer picture, and what are the different ways that you can stroke it with the brush and paint the picture. It's the same type of deal.
There's got to be some. How do I say this? I think finding good football players is easy, but I think the biggest part of like data, metrics, analytics, all this other stuff too, and this is why a lot of GMs lose their job, is a lot of GMs can draft good players or find good players, but they're not good team builders. And I think that's another like art of scouting. It has to be, I need to find the right guys, not just the good guys. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And because I can draft a shitload of good football players, but a lot of times we see teams do that and the team still sucks and the GMs still lose their jobs. And you're like, well, I mean, a lot of guys on Twitter could have told you these aren't the right guys. And so hopefully, with all this stuff, we can kind of use that going forward as well and say like, okay, these two guys have similar grades. The data tells us really good stuff about both of them. Tape was really great, but who's better for our team? And it's like this year we have like the edge rusher group. I see a lot of talk about Dallas Turner versus Chop Robinson, Leatu Latu versus Jared Verse. And these teams are going to have to go through and say like, who fits better? Why are they different? Who's better at what? Who's better suited for our team and why? And I think a lot of these like tools are probably going to help these teams make those tough choices, as well as separate these receivers who are, a bunch of freaks this year. And like we talked about last episode too, like how do you separate all these guys? This is probably a big step in that direction of like finding which guys have red flags as far as, the data tells us which guys fit certain boxes and whatever for us, and who are the outlier, all that kind of stuff. So I think team building is like the main end game in the NFL versus just finding good players. And that's something that I think has kind of resonated more and more when you, like John, we've been in this industry for a long time. We've met scouts, we've met some GMs, we've had a lot of conversations with a lot of football people. And you think like, how did some of these guys lose their jobs? They're brilliant. And, they seem good at their jobs. They seem like they know what they're talking about. But I think if you don't know how to build a team, that's a whole different art than just finding good players.
No, that's a good point too. Because I mean, just even look at how you build a wide receiver room. You got certain teams out there like Jacksonville right now that's built basically the same player. They're all the same player. They all have the same skill set.
Yeah.
And in theory, it's a great idea because we could just move and match and whatever. It doesn't work. You got to have a guy that you got to have different skill sets, different elements of threats, and just building your wide receiver room. That's just one position group.
Well, like on 3rd and 9, who do you throw the ball to on Miami? Waddle or Hill? Like, sorry, but neither of those guys are the guys that I want on the field when I have to.
They're not big physical guys that are going to go up and make a contested catch.
Yeah, I got to get them wide open.
First down chains.
Yeah. You got to.
No, I agree, and that's kind of like that's. I would agree that would be another point of what the art of scouting is also the aspect of team building and what the right guy is.
Yeah.
There's 2 points I want to touch on here, and number one is that aspect of, remember when we talked about kind of emergent phenomena, and it was like, maybe the team has properties that aren't necessarily represented by the sum of all of its parts, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
John.
Mm-hmm.
I think we talked about, so like Jack Campbell is an example. Jack Campbell, what did he go, 17th overall?
Yeah, 19th. Yeah, I think
19th. So that pick got torn up, right? Like people are like, why would you take a linebacker here, blah blah blah, and so on and so forth. But if you know the type of character that he is, he probably elevated guys around him in their work habits and their approach. I mean, there are probably things that we cannot represent, statistically about him, whether it's player tracking or whatever. There's nothing, you can't do that. You could try to maybe go for like, we have these personality tests, blah blah blah. That personality psychology stuff's a freaking nightmare. But the point being that like you said, team building is kind of this art where there's this, subjective element, but it kind of, the overall output emerges from all the parts. It's not like you just draft all the good players and you have a good team necessarily, right? So I think that's particularly interesting. I think that's a great point. I think, John, the thing, and this is something I battled with a lot, right? When I shifted a lot towards, let me just look at the overall profile and get away a little bit from the tape. Am I hesitating to back off on watching more tape and doing this extra work and keep, trying to do the traditional scouting method because I believe there's more value in it accuracy wise, or I think it improves what the end product is for me? Or am I doing it because it's just what I've always done and what I'm comfortable with, right? Like, am I sticking to grinding the tape because I know how to do it? In my opinion, I believe like, okay, it's more enjoyable than sitting there and just looking at this guy ran a 4.3. Okay, top 50 pick. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that maybe you're thinking that I'm completely against data. And I'm not trying to look at it
no. I'm not saying you're completely against it. I'm saying like in terms of just the balance, right? Like the balance of how much is going to be the tape work and try and use that human intuition and how much is going to be reliance on that type of, the algorithm or whatever you want to.
Okay, yeah, I can see. So I couldn't tell you what my percentage is right now. If I had to guess, it's probably 60-40 in value tape. There's a lot of analytics that I do use. And because it has been something I've gradually used more and more and more, especially the deeper you go into a class, the more people that you're looking at, the more people that you're trying to, take in.
You got to have some filters.
Yeah, you got to, exactly. And you don't have the time to necessarily sit there and go through every single guy in the same way that you were when you were breaking down 200, 250 guys in a class, So I think that data has helped me in the sense of just helping me get through time, but also backing up when I'm trying to use the data to back up what I'm seeing, and using that as a safeguard. Okay, so if that number pops up and it's not matching what I had in there, I need to go take another look at it. So it's a red flag indicator, and see what I missed. Because look at the Texas guys, for example. Nobody expected Worthy to run a 4.21. And so naturally, I didn't expect AD Mitchell to run a 4.3 because I was expecting Worthy to run a 4.3. So my whole perspective of what Mitchell was going to run was based on what I thought Worthy was going to run.
Mm-hmm.
So I was off on both of them because I was thinking Mitchell is going to run probably 0.10, 0.15 under what Worthy runs. And Worthy's probably going to run a 4.3 something. So, I missed based off of, the testing numbers just because I underestimated how fast Worthy was. So, I think that that's where the data kind of comes in. That's where it's really helpful in the sense of those checks and balances, right? But I wasn't trying to turn it into a data people versus film people,
I
or
know.
football people.
I'm using the
It was
lingo of Dimitrov here in terms of football people, data people.
Right. Yeah.
In group, out group.
It's because there is a blend that you have to have. And I think, especially nowadays, especially in the field that we work in, which is watching all these different guys and going way deeper into classes than most NFL teams do. I think that you have to have the data to help you back it up and make sense out of a lot of what you're seeing. So,
yeah, I know Game's got to get out of here, but I would throw one more point out too, and that's this aspect of, I think, particularly with human intuition, right? Us individually, like me, just as by myself as an evaluator, you guys just by yourself as evaluators, we're flawed, right? We see the game from a very certain perspective, and I think this is one of those things where data models are often great, but they're often also limited in ways that they can't capture things that people can see. I think a good aggregate of evaluators, if us three just went and just watched tape, looked and talked a guy out, and let's say, okay, we came in with all of our grades and kind of, figured out a way to aggregate that and put that together, it would produce a judgment that's better than any one of us individually. But probably if you had enough people, would produce a judgment that is better than any model could be. So I think that's one thing that is very, very overlooked right now, and that could add a lot of value is, just combining and aggregating in a proper way rather than just like the GM goes up and says, I'm moving the card here, like crap like that.
Yeah. Mark, real quick before we go, shout out to you because you changed my whole perspective this season, especially on not evaluating as a whole, but kind of the way I go about adjusting certain things. And it was when we had a talk a long time ago about Marvin Harrison Jr. and we were asking what makes him better than everyone else and what would drop him. And ask that question to people and yourself, what would it take to change your mind? That was the coolest thing ever because now I think going through these players, I get to set kind of my own outliers and like my own like boundaries. I don't know if that's the right word. Like I'll go through certain players and I'm like, look, if Keon Coleman runs sub 4.63, I know I'm going to feel comfortable myself moving him down because I'm taking a number that's like on paper and I get to do, you also get to kind of set your own limits and do certain things with the tackles. I'm like, look, if this guy comes in above this height and below this arm length, I know that's my threshold. And so it's kind of cool because you were like, what does it take to change your mind? And as an evaluator, at the end of the day, you only have yourself. You're doing, I'm doing the work. I can't let anyone else do it for me. So I have to do it. And it's kind of like, I get to set my own limits and my own thresholds for some of these players. And it's kind of cool because before I'm like, is that number okay with me? But now I'm like, look, do it. Like make it to where this will change your mind. This won't, and stick to it. And it's been kind of a game changer, especially with these receivers, like going through last night. I was up to like 3 a.m. and I'm watching some of the film and then comparing the numbers. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. And then, you look at the 10-yard split for some of these guys and I'm like, that's too slow. Or, you know what I mean? Like something like that. And you're like, that's below my number. So like, I'm going to drop him. And it's just been really kind of fun to do that and like apply all that stuff. And it gives you kind of like a black and white look on certain things instead of just constantly battling yourself and being like, I don't really know what I think about this guy, or I don't know how to interpret this number. So it's been pretty cool. And I actually appreciate you for it a lot. So
yeah, it's funny. Actually, that wasn't even my intent. You actually took something that is actually a completely different idea from I think it was actually in Thinking Fast and Slow, where you kind of have a preset. Hey, if this happens, then you go from there. I can't remember if it was Thinking Fast and Slow or what, but point being that you actually took what would it take to change your mind was actually intended for something else. And you applied it in a way that is really a beautiful thing, because when you see, we talked about last episode, right? Like that Keon Coleman 4.62. John, you thought he was going to run 4.45.
4.64.
And 4.64. Okay.
I think so, yeah.
So, but 4.62. I just looked at the numbers.
Shit.
But John, you thought he was going to go 4.45. There's an extreme amount of cognitive dissonance when you see that number. When you have that, I think this guy's going to be this fast, and he goes below that. It like you're sitting there like, what the F just happened? What caused me to be like? I'll be very upfront. And actually, I forget who I was talking to. I think it was an agent. I told this when Tyree Wilson came out off the junior tape. I thought he was going to be a practice squad type guy. Like I thought his junior tape sucked. Then I saw the Blesto grade was whatever it was, Kate leaked, and it was a first round, top of the draft and so on and so forth. And all throughout the process, I'm seeing this guy, he's going top 10, he's going top 10. I'm like, what the hell is wrong with me where I put this guy down here? Am I stupid? Like, it's hard, right? It's very difficult when you face those things that kind of, create that internal, what's going on? Like, why did I miss this? But that's kind of why you have those practices like, if he falls down here, I'm going to adjust so on and so forth. That kind of act as a guardrail for you.
Well, again, there you go. You got marked. Boom.
And I liked it, buddy.
Well, we're at 50 minutes, guys. I think this has been a really good conversation. And I'm sure that we're a little over out of time, but that's okay. So, Gam, you got to run. So let's get everybody out of here. Shane,
I got to zoom.
well, first off, thanks for listening. Hit Gam at Gam Scout. Follow Jarvis at Jarvis Scouting. Follow me at Draft Vogel. And Shane, get us out of here.
And that's a wrap. Hope you don't miss us too much until next time. Follow the Sick Podcast with Draft Vogel on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts.